Today in history, on June 19th, the year 1097, Christians of the First Crusade achieved their first victory over invading Islam at Nicaea, where the first universal Christian creed was formulated and recited. First, some background. In the years following the decisive Battle of Manzikert in 1071, when the Seljuk Turks defeated the Eastern Roman Empire and overran that ancient bastion of Christianity, Anatolia, today modern-day Turkey, countless atrocities were committed. Whether an anonymous Georgian chronicler told of how, quote, holy churches served as stables for their horses, the priests were immolated during the Holy Communion itself, the virgins defiled, the youths circumcised and the infants taken away, or whether Anna Komnena, the princess at Constantinople, told of how, quote, cities were obliterated, lands were plundered, and the whole of Anatolia was stained with Christian blood. It was the same scandalous tale of woe that reached Europe, Western Europe. As a result, what came to be known as history's First Crusade was launched. Paraphrasing Pope Urban II's famous call at Clermont in 1095, Crusades historian Thomas Madden wrote, quote, the message was clear. Christ was crucified again in the persecution of his faithful and the defilement of his sanctuaries. Both needed rescuing. Both offered an opportunity to fulfill one of Christ's two greatest commandments. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Luke 10:27. So Christians from all around Europe hearkened to the call and took the cross. By 1097, the major lords and knights had reached Constantinople, whence they were ferried into the Lion's Den, Turkic-controlled Asia Minor then. By May, they had reached Nicaea, site of Christendom's first ecumenical council, where the Nicene Creed, which is still professed by all major Christian denominations, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, was articulated in 325. Now it was the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate and occupied by the quote-unquote enemies of the cross, as the Muslims were known. The Crusaders began the siege of then Muslim-occupied Nicaea on May 14th, 1097. It was long and brutal, but the Turks held their own. From their high walls, the Muslims, quote, shouted their warlike battle cry in the horrible tones of their language. The contemporary chronicler, Albert of Akan, wrote, not being able to decipher the well-recognized cries of Allahu Akbar then. And they fired poisoned arrows so that even those lightly wounded met a horrible death, he wrote. Moreover, in order to defend their walls from being struck and shaken repeatedly by the battering ram, the Turks created a combustible mixture and poured it over the walls, which torched the battering ram. Smoke, fire, and screams rose as the siege dragged on. On May 20th, Kilyij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan and supreme head of the Turks, appeared with a massive Muslim army to deliver Nicaea, then his capital. A wild battle ensued. Albert of Akan continues, quote, Duke Godfrey and Bohemond, then being two leaders of the First Crusade, did not curb their horses, but flew in the midst of the enemy, piercing some with lances, unsaddling others, and all the while urging on their allies, encouraging them with manly exhortations to slaughter the enemy. There was no small clash of spears there, no small rings of swords, and helmets heard in this conflict of the war, no small destruction of the Turks. But it was the greater force of the Crusader army under the command of Raymond of Toulouse, with aid from Count Robert of Flanders, that gave the Muslim army its death stroke, routing them. In this, the inaugural battle of the First Crusade, quote, the Arabs, Persians, and ferocious Turks soon fled. The savage people showed their backs to the Christians. It was a rout. Prodigious was the slaughter of the fleeing army. From the 3rd until the 9th hour, the destruction, or rather Arabian slaughter, of this battle raged. This triumphant description is not so much invention and bias on the part of Guibert of Nogent, as it is in fact a reflection of the fact that this vast Muslim army was not made of professional soldiers, but largely consisted of, quote, peasants and scum herded together from everywhere. Later Turkish armies would be more formidable. Having slaughtered countless Muslims, the Westerners resumed the siege of Nicaea. In order to make clear to its Turkish occupiers that they could no longer hope to be delivered from outside aid, the Crusaders, quote, lobbed the severed heads of the slaughtered Turks from their throwing machines and catapults to the city, to quote Robert the Monk. There was, of course, a reason that the Crusaders behaved so ruthlessly. Earlier, on first landing in Anatolia, they had encountered a horrific sight. Quote, oh, how many severed heads and bones of the dead lying on the plains did we then find beyond Nicomedia, near the sea, wrote the eyewitness Fulcher of Chartres. Moved to compassion by this, we shed many tears there. They had come upon the remains of all those European commoners, men, women, and children, that were too impatient to wait for the professional knights at Constantinople, and so had crossed into Asia Minor alone, against Emperor Alexius's counsel. Soon after landing in the Nicaean inland in 1096, they fell into the Turkish ambuscade and were miserably slaughtered, wrote Princess Anna Komnena, adding that, quote, "So great a multitude of Celts and Normans died by the Ishmaelite sword, that when they gathered the remains of the fallen, lying on every side, they heaped up, I will not say a mighty ridge, or hill, or peak, but a mountain of considerable height and depth and width. So huge was the mass of bones." The Christians who were captured at this time underwent a different trial. In the words of Guibert, quote, "Some of the prisoners were challenged about their faith and ordered to renounce Christ, but they proclaimed Christ with steady heart and voice, and were decapitated. The fate of those kept alive, as usual, the young and comely, was often worse." He continues, quote, "The Turks divided up among themselves some of the captives, whose lives they had spared, or rather reserved for a more painful death, and submitted them to dismal servitude at the hands of cruel masters. Some were exposed in public like targets and were pierced by arrows. Others were given away as gifts, while others were sold outright and taken to Muslim lands where they would endure wretched slavery under the worst masters imaginable. They underwent a torture much longer than that endured by those whose heads were severed swiftly by the sword." Indeed, how the Islamic lords of Turkic-controlled Asia Minor must have laughed then. Having annihilated the indigenous Christian population of Anatolia, now European Christians were marching in for the same exact treatment. But they were not laughing now. Along with the many Muslim heads the Crusaders were lobbing into Nicaea, another 1,000 of these heads were sent to the Eastern Roman Emperor, a present which won his hearty favor. Unsurprisingly so, as these were the same men who had sacked and slaughtered all the Christians of Nicaea in 1092, just 5 years earlier when it was still ruled by the Christian emperor. He responded by sending more supplies, including much-needed boats, for the Crusaders to cut off Nicaea's only supply route. These, the Crusaders, during the course of one night, by ropes placed on the shoulders and necks of men and horses, dragged to Nicaea a distance of 7 miles or more, wrote William of Tyre. Soon thereafter, on June 19th, 1097, that is on today's date, the now overly traumatized Turks, these longtime scourges of Eastern Christendom, surrendered Nicaea, on condition that they capitulate not to the heavily armored newcomers from the west, who had so terrorized them, but to Emperor Alexius, who had followed the Crusaders with his own army. Thus the First Crusade began with a magnificent victory over the Muslim invaders, witnessing the liberation of a site so important to early Christendom, Nicaea. Okay, there it is. For more on the Crusades, see my book, Sword and Scimitar, which this video was based on. Bye.